Hello and welcome back to our discussion about the efferent division. In this video, we're going to be talking about autonomic synapses. Okay, so in the previous section, we saw how the anatomy differs between the sympathetic and the parasympathetic nervous systems. I am here to tell you that they also use different neurotransmitters. So I want to show you those differences, okay? So again, remember we have our preganglionic neuron synapsing at the ganglion onto the postganglionic neuron, which then provides an output to the target, okay? So looking at that first synapse, the one that's in the autonomic ganglion, the one between the preganglionic neuron and the postganglionic neuron, we have actually the same neurotransmitter and the same type of receptor being used by both the sympathetic and the parasympathetic nervous systems. So in the sympathetic nervous system, we have, in both, we have acetylcholine acting as our neurotransmitter. That acetylcholine is going to bind to nicotinic receptors on the postganglionic neuron, okay? Looking at the second synapse, we have different neurotransmitters and receptors being used by our two different branches of the autonomic nervous system. So looking at the sympathetic, our neurotransmitter is norepinephrine, and our receptor on the target is what's called an adrenergic receptor, okay? If we look at the parasympathetic nervous system, we use acetylcholine as a neurotransmitter, and our acetylcholine is going to bind to muscarinic receptors on the target. Notice that we have the same neurotransmitter. If we look at the parasympathetic, we have the same neurotransmitter being used at both the first synapse and the second synapse, but we have different receptors being used. So first synapse has nicotinic receptors, second synapse has muscarinic receptors, okay? So just to emphasize this point yet again, I just want to remind you, when we have the same neurotransmitter, the same molecule binding to different receptors, we get different responses, okay? So in this example, we have epinephrine, which is like a neurohormone, binding to two different receptors on its targets, alpha and beta 2, and leading to different responses. Okay, so we're going to get that same thing happening here. So we have acetylcholine on a nicotinic receptor, that's going to lead to one response. Acetylcholine on a muscarinic receptor is going to lead to a different type of response. Okay. All right, so now that we've talked about the neurotransmitters, let's talk about that synapse at the target. Okay, so first of all, I just want to bring up this figure that you've seen before when we talked about synaptic transmission. So far, we've been looking at synapses that look like this. You have one neuron synapsing onto another neuron, and it's a very specific relationship. It's a very precise. You have, this neuron, this specific neuron synapsing onto this specific neuron, okay? In the autonomic nervous system, at our autonomic targets, we have a very different situation, okay? So we don't have that. What we have instead is shown in the next slide, but before I show you the next slide, I want to remind you of the anatomy, right? So remember, we have a preganglionic neuron synapsing at the ganglion onto a postganglionic neuron, and then that is going to synapse onto our target, okay? So the synapse that we're looking at here is this one right here, okay? And it has a unique anatomy as indicated by the text on the slide. Okay, so let's look at that unique anatomy, okay? So looking at the axon of that postganglionic neuron, okay? If we look at it, the terminal of that postganglionic autonomic neuron doesn't look like what we've seen in other pictures, right? This is kind of atypical, okay? So instead of having just a simple synaptic terminal, we have this axon branching out, okay? And those branches form these little swellings called varicosities, varicosity, okay? Inside of each varicosity are synaptic vesicles filled with neurotransmitter, okay? And as you can see, these branches kind of spread out over the target, okay? So if we imagine what's gonna happen when we get an action potential coming down this axon, right? What's gonna happen? We are going to trigger neurotransmitter release at all of these varicosities, okay? So the result of that is basically that we're just dumping neurotransmitter all over our target, okay? So instead of having that specific one-to-one relationship that we saw with the synapses that we were looking at before, we have just kind of like a mass release of neurotransmitter at the target. So we have this diffuse neurotransmitter release that is going to lead to like kind of a global response from the target, right? So instead of just telling like one little cell to do something, you're telling this whole area to do whatever it is, right? So in this case, it's smooth muscle. It's going to tell the smooth muscle to contract.